Welcome to the Curely Cultivation Podcast, where we like to dig a little deeper. Today's topic is toxicity. This is number 24 of the Curely Cultivation Podcast. If you're interested, you can check up our backlog of podcasts, which is actually quite extensive. I think it's over 125 now with various names. I've had the podcast going for about eight years now. So anyway, it was the Panhandle Primate podcast, and then it was the Deprogram, and now it's the Curely Cultivation. Anyway, you can check those out if you are at all interested. Toxicity has permeated every aspect of our culture today. But today, in this episode, we kind of explore the idea of toxicity as a metaphor and kind of play around with it a little bit. It was kind of an interesting episode. I think it tied it together at the end, but anyway, and we were on a little bit of a time crunch because, life. So, anyway, thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you for giving it attention. Lord knows there's a thousand things that you could be giving your attention to, and the fact that you are either watching my face and listening to my voice right now means a lot to me, and I very much appreciate it. You can check out our website, which is thecurelycultivation.com. You can hopefully follow the podcast on Spotify. You can subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or you can follow me at Panhandle Primate on Instagram, or you can follow the Curely Cultivation, which is a little bit more family-oriented. Thank you for listening and checking it out, and hopefully you enjoy this episode. We're really enjoying the process of creating. I say enjoying. At times, I actually find it incredibly monotonous and mundane. And there's a lot of times, probably most of the time, where I'm sitting there thinking, like, what am I doing and why am I doing this? But it has been fun. I don't have a natural proclivity to technology and interfacing with it, So I've been having some trouble learning the video stuff, and have no idea what I'm doing with the lighting, which is why I just stick it anywhere and just shine it. That's why I've got like lines on my forehead, because I don't know how to set up my own lighting. So hopefully at some point in time down the road, if we start getting some traction, I can bring in a professional to at least set up some stuff for me, help me with the studio. But until then, what you get is a DIY slap together project that isn't ever finished when I turn it in, if it makes sense. Anyway, thank y'all. All this to say, thank you for paying attention. Thank you for engaging with the content, and drop us a message somewhere. I list those specifically because it's easy for me to track feedback in Spotify and on YouTube and on Instagram. If you're listening on a different podcatcher, more power to you. I appreciate that. But I might not necessarily see your review or see your comment if you leave one. But you can always reach out to me. You can send me a message at panhandleprimate.com or panhandleprimate@gmail.com. Just shoot me an email with the subject podcast, and turn us in a topic if you have a topic that you want us to go over. You're interested in something that we said, or you need clarification or something like that. We've actually had several listeners recently contact us, and it's led to several episodes, and definitely some interesting discussions, and the deepening of the concepts. So anyway, thank you. Like I said, thank you for paying attention. And hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Peace.
Okay.
All right. So, gotta adjust. Just get set. Okay. So today's episode topic is toxicity. What was the first thing you thought of whenever I said that today's topic was going to be toxicity?
I guess I was just questioning what you mean by it because I feel like it now applies to a lot of things. So I didn't know if you just meant the general idea of toxicity or if you actually had something specific by it.
So your first reaction was a question? Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, just because we use it for so many things nowadays. Right? Like toxic positivity, toxic masculinity, toxic workplaces, toxic relationships, toxic foods, toxic environments,
toxic parents,
toxic culture.
Yeah.
So that was just my question.
Toxic
like,
generations.
Yeah, it's like, well, how are you applying it, I guess?
Okay.
Or just the general idea of
So
toxicity.
both of those, or I guess all of that, is what this episode's about.
Okay.
So it's just a general approach to toxicity, just to a toxic environment. And so I guess I have a slightly maybe unique perspective on this because I am a hazmat technician. Yeah, technician. So I have my hazmat technician certification. I'm hazmat certified. So if there is not currently, but with my original department, Amarillo, if there was a hazmat event, we had a hazmat team that responded to it. And each discipline in the fire service has different requirements and ways of thinking. You have to think. So if you have a fire, you have to think about it different than if you have an emergency medical call, which you have to think different than if you have a rescue. And all of them overlap in the fact that it's dangerous, right? It's a dangerous environment that you have to go into. But all of them require a slightly different way of viewing the situation. And so hazmat school is kind of about that, right? It's about how do you approach a dangerous situation and make good decisions, right? And so it's how to respond to a spill. One of the first things that you learn in the world of hazmat is the hot zone, the warm zone, and the cold zone. So the concept of this is if you're in the cold zone, the toxic thing poses you no threat, right? If you're in the warm zone, then basically contaminants come into the warm zone. So that's where you get undressed from your hazmat gear, And then you have the hot zone, which is you're immediately exposed to the toxic environment, And so one of the other things you learn is a go or a no-go environment, right? Or a situation. If I throw on my air pack, can I run into this cloud of vapor, grab a victim that does not have an air pack and pull them out? What's the danger of that to me as a first responder? And is it worth the danger, right? If I know I can run into a chemical with just my turnout gear, my bunker gear on with an air pack, and it says, hey, if you run into that cloud of vapor, you have a 30% higher chance of developing cancer, right? But there's a guy that's laying on the ground and is choking to death, and I can run in and grab him, right? That might be a risk that we're willing to take, risk analysis. And sometimes another thing that you learn in hazmat is sometimes the right thing to do is nothing, which is counterintuitive to most of the other disciplines in the fire service. So sometimes the right thing is to do nothing. And here I was just going to give a quick, one of my friends in Amarillo, still a friend, he's a retired chief. He was like a hazmat guru, is kind of what he was known as, but his name was Kevin. And I might have him on the show sometime. But he used to do this in his hazmat classes. What he would do is he would have a piece of paper up at the front of the room, and on a pin, he would cover the pin in glow-in-the-dark material, right? And he would say, okay, everybody, I need y'all to come to the front of the room. use this pen and sign in, right? And so everybody comes up and grabs the pen. They pass the pen along to each other. And then he tells them, like, look, one of the really important things is dealing with contamination. So actively try not to touch your face, not to touch a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to start practicing like cleanliness or whatever. Cleanliness. Well, they don't know that they have this stuff on their hands already, you know? And so he does his class. He says that everybody's touching their face and rubbing on their nose and they're touching all of their stuff. And before lunch, he would turn the lights out with a black light. And like just everybody would look around the room and you could see it all over people's faces and all over their hands and all over the tables and everything. And that's what he was saying is he was like, look, you don't even realize.
Yeah.
Even if you're conscious of it, you're, you know, and you're cross-contaminating stuff. And anyway, it was just kind of a fun, you know, you're never exactly sure how exposed to something you are in the environment. And so there was a few realizations that I had exiting out of hazmat class. And the first one was the only defense against toxicity is insulation. Does that make sense?
Just like protection?
Well, like, so the 3 insulating things in hazmat is time, distance, and shielding, right? Do I have something between me and that thing?
So just barriers.
Barriers, right. Yeah, insulation, which is, you know.
Boundaries,
right. Well, there's a whole bunch of different, that's why I'm saying I was setting up the metaphor, right? Okay, so toxicity applied in the metaphorical world, right? So, of course, we have the toxic relationship, right? And you can jump in at any point in time if you have anything to say.
I'm just waiting to see, I guess, where you're going with it.
So that was the introduction, right?
Okay.
It was just that was kind of the setup for toxicity and dealing with toxicity, right? And now there's a whole lot of different ways that like toxicity, which is, how would you define toxicity, I guess? Let's start with that.
Being exposed to anything that is harmful to you. Or like something that is toxic is harmful to you.
Okay. Right.
At its very like most basic.
So toxicity is the level at which something is harmful to you. So everybody's heard about, you know, everybody drinks water. Everybody should be drinking water on a regular basis. But do you know that water is toxic? If
you have too much of it?
If it's in your lungs, water's toxic.
Oh, yeah. It needs to be in the appropriate
spot. There
spot.
is a level of water toxicity. I can't remember what the actual term for that is. But yeah, you drink too much water. There was I think a lady who was trying to win an Xbox for a kid.
I did see that and drank too much water and
died.
Yeah. I mean, everything can be toxic depending on the amount of it.
Right. So, yeah, I think that's important is things can be good and then can, at a certain point, at a certain level, become toxic.
There are some things which are just bad in and of themselves, or harmful to you in and of itself. And then there are some things which too much of it is harmful.
So I should have looked this up a little bit more before, because I haven't brushed up on my hazmat terminology in a long time. But in the hazmat world, like if you're dealing with hazardous environments, like Pantex or something like that, where there's radiation, you have permissible exposure limits that are set for you. And so basically they say, hey, look, we know what you're around is going to be dangerous. It is a toxic thing.
That's like there are toxic substances.
But we're going to limit how much you're exposed to it. And through that limiting, through that shielding, the insulation, it can become less toxic.
Yeah.
And so, of course, we have the relationships. You know, I think a lot of people have toxic relationships, mostly because people are toxic towards themselves in a way, you know? I think most of the time if you're in a relationship with somebody and it's a toxic relationship, it's because one person either wants bad for the other person. Well, maybe I guess that's the way it's
I don't know. I mean, I feel like toxic relationships is a little bit of a tricky one. Because on one hand, there are toxic people, and I don't think it's that they necessarily, I think some people, I guess, do want harm for the other person. I think some people don't necessarily, they're not looking for harm for the other person. They're just oblivious to other people. And they're usually not self-aware, and they're usually more what's the word I'm looking for?
Focused?
Self-focused. They're just thinking about themselves. Self-absorbed, yes. And so by them being self-absorbed, they are harming other people.
Right.
And so I think that's probably the majority of toxic relationships, other than the few ones who are truly trying to abuse, whether emotionally or physically. That's obviously, like, very toxic.
I want to inject something here because... So this idea jumped into my head through me looking at a group, right? It was a group of people that were all in the same area, and different people I just was watching people interact around the room, right? And one of the things I've noticed about our generation is really bad with our kids around the phone, right? The phone is just this catastrophic, in a lot of ways, toxic.
It's very much.
It has a toxicity level to it. And I was looking around the room, and there was this kid who was on the phone the whole time. There was never a part where he wasn't on the phone. He was looking at the phone. He was absorbed with the phone. And the mom kept, like, paying attention to him, but, like, catering to him. Hey, are you okay? Hey, do you need anything? Hey, turn it down a little bit, okay? Hey, it was all interaction with the phone. And I was sitting there thinking, like, man, that's a toxic relationship, right? A parent who I just want the best for my kids. I just want my kids to have the best,
Well,
right?
I think that's where this gets interesting. Like, if you think about toxic positivity, for example, I think that's a good way to relate it, in that people often think they are doing good, being good, practicing good habits, but it can be too much. And so we call that toxic. So I feel like this is really a shortcoming of the word toxic, so it's called semantic broadening, that we've now applied it to too many things for it to actually mean something. It's become too broad. We can apply it to absolutely everything, and so it's losing the intensity of its meaning.
Right.
Which is normal. That's the way language works, is we take a word, we apply it to as many things as we can before it no longer has meaning, and then we find a new word to put to it.
Right.
And so I get what you're saying. I think all those things are true, and they are toxic by definition of toxic, like toxicity. But at the same time, I guess I'm just wondering if it's losing the meaning when we apply it to too much.
No, so I'm not necessarily focusing on the word toxicity. I'm more on the concept of toxicity.
Something being harmful to yourself.
In amounts. And yeah, just looking at that. Because I mean,
then yes,
like I said,
think that parents who enable their children is a form of harming your children.
And it's not out of malice. Like, that's what I'm trying to say is, like, there's a lot of times where a thing is a good thing until it reaches a certain threshold. And then it passes over from a good thing to a harmful thing. Or, like, for instance, wanting what's best for your kid or wanting the best for your kid, right? I want my kid to be successful. We just finished the David Beckham documentary 4-part series. And at one point in it, it was talking about David Beckham's dad and how he was, like, hyper obsessed with David Beckham being really good at soccer. And, of course, he had this natural talent for it. He was in the right place. And then he had a dad who just pushed him every day to practice. And in some regards, that was, like, great. Like, David Beckham's super successful. But that whole documentary, it's all of these things that are happening to this guy where it's like, it's glorified because he's rich and famous and he has just this world. But as I'm looking at it, you could really interpret it as a horror movie, right? Like, he's so isolated. He has to run from car to plane to car to plane. He's on the road all the time. All of his closest relationships, they're just work friends. Like,
I don't necessarily think that's bad.
I'm not saying it's bad. It's just there are aspects of his story that looked amazing and looked really cool and like, man, I wish I lived that life. And then there's other aspects of the story where you're like, golly, I'm glad that
because he's so exposed to toxic things, he has to be highly insulated.
Yes.
Which it can be very negative.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And I also think that if he weren't David Beckham, when you look at certain parenting styles, it seems more toxic. Like if you were to just take your average Joe who said, my dad pushed me really hard to be a soccer player, but I wasn't. And like you can almost look at that and be like, oh man, the dad should have just chilled out, right? Like you should have enjoyed your childhood. But because it's David Beckham and it worked out, it's like, well, was the dad really wrong?
Right.
And I mean, I don't know enough about the relationship to know how the dad was.
Right.
So I'm not saying he was good or bad. I don't know.
All I'm meaning with bringing that up is that a little bit of a good thing is a good thing, but there could be a very low tolerance for that thing. So like fame or money or power or influence, right?
Well, and we're willing to take on a lot if we know it will pay off. So, for example, maybe David Beckham's dad was toxic. Again, I don't actually know. But we can look at it now and say, but was it really bad if it created David Beckham?
Right.
Or we see people who are maybe business owners and they work 70-hour weeks, they're exhausted, they're stressed, but they've created a business and it will pay off for them someday.
Right.
And so we can look at that and we can say, well, we can weigh the pros and cons and maybe it's worth it to take on this level of toxicity because you're going to get this in the end.
That's the go or no go, right? That's
like
that's the risk analysis of the situation. It's like, okay, I know it's going to affect my health, but I really want that Big Mac from McDonald's, right? It's like, okay, maybe it's a trade-off that you decide. But if you don't view it as having a threshold of toxicity, you might think, you know what? My favorite food is Big Macs from McDonald's. I'm going to eat one every day.
Yeah, you still have to be able to balance it out.
Yeah,
Then
you're
yourself.
beyond a toxic level of Big Macs, right? Maybe one Big Mac a year is an okay level. But if you're eating more than that, it's probably not good for it's probably going to have a long-term negative impact on your health. Okay, so that was relationships.
Amongst many other things.
But like environment, I'll just list off a few of these real quick.
Okay.
Obviously, environmental toxicity, that's kind of what hazmat is about, you know. But there's other aspects of it too, like, for instance, if your environment, you're like in a group of friends, and actually it's like a good friendship, everybody has a good friendship, but you know, you just get in that toxic state of mind where everybody's just kind of negative. You're like, I hate this. Oh, I'm not into that. Blah, blah, blah. It can become toxic really quickly, you know, an environment. But also like media, I believe like media is very toxic in,
it is.
In every sense. Culture can be very, you know, toxic especially if you let it start to define you, right? You're being defined by the culture isn't defined by you. And then we got the financial system. In my opinion, the financial system, it's very interesting how easy it is to just say it is how it is and this is how it should be, you know? But even, you know, like incurring debt or like the credit system, man, what were they talking? I heard something that they were allowing lenders to do that just seemed like a really bad idea. It was like 0 down lending, but it was like at a really high rate. It might have been like a payday advance loan or something like that. Anyway, they're letting them do something new that is just going to get people. It's just going to cripple people, you know, financially for years to come. Ideologies can be very toxic.
Yeah.
I think religions have almost a tendency, proclivity towards being pretty negative. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I'm not sure I have it fully worked out yet. I guess, and maybe this is meaningless. You can tell me if this train of thought should go somewhere or should just end here.
Okay.
We do apply the idea of toxicity or like being toxic to many different things. And many different things can be toxic. So environments, I think religion, food, relationships, all those things can be toxic, right?
Right.
And again, the level at which it affects us changes its toxicity. So I am on board with all of that. I completely agree.
Okay.
However, sometimes I wonder if we say something... How am I trying to word this? Should something being toxic... No, I feel like that's not the way to say it. Are we saying things are toxic simply because we don't like them? Or because they are truly hurting us?
So, I guess...
And I'm not saying you were doing this. I'm saying I think I see this tendency throughout culture nowadays where it's, I don't like this, therefore it's toxic. It's not bringing me joy, therefore it's toxic. It's not making me happy, it's not making me better, therefore it's toxic.
So, that is the next...
Okay, then continue.
Okay. So, I think just really one more thing to mention on that, on the toxic applied metaphorically, would be to the diet. Like, it's pretty easy to, like, look at the diet and say, what do I ingest? What are we ingesting? Right?
Well, I think that one's really easy because you can look at certain foods that just are toxic. Like a piece of candy, like Skittles, for example. They taste delicious, but truly the food in them is toxic to your body.
Right.
There is no arguing with that, right? It's not like saying, well, this food over here provides certain good nutrients, but can also be bad. It's like Skittles in and of themselves have food dyes, have a ton of sugar, have just a lot of other processed material. There's nothing in them that is actually good for you.
So
it is purely just a treat food.
I've been listening to Sean Baker. He's Dr. Sean Baker. He's a carnivore diet guy. I say listen to him. I just follow him on Instagram. He pops up occasionally. But I think it's really interesting because he, like, hates vegans. You know? Like, he posts memes all the time of, like, you know, somebody not being able to lift something up, and it'll just say, like, vegan under it, you know? And, you know, and then vegans specifically, not just vegetarians, hate him because all he consumes, all he consumes is meat. You know, like, literally that's his entire diet is just meat. That's all he eats. And so they kind of hate him. And so there's this argument going back and forth. And I think it is an interesting and compelling argument. Like, I kind of like weighing in from the edge because I will never be one of the two extremists. Because, number one, I do see the benefits of eating meat, you know, and I do see the benefit, but I don't know. To me, it could become a toxic practice, you know, if you're consuming, maybe not a toxic practice for your body, but maybe a toxic practice for society.
Well, that's what I was going to say is I think there's so many different ways. There can be, like, physically toxic, like Skittles. They're physically bad for you, right? Like, the food is poison. It is bad for your body. Then there are certain things that are, like, toxic for your mentality. So people talk about, like, dieting. Hey, even if you're eating a salad for every meal and that's actually good for you, it can be toxic to your mental health because now all you're focusing on is your weight, what you aren't eating, and you're miserable.
Right.
So that can be toxic mentally. Then there's also, on a toxic, like, societal level of, you know,
consumerism.
Yeah, like consumerism of, hey, individually it's not making you unhappy and maybe it is actually helping you in many things, but it is poisoning our landfills.
Right.
Like, quite literally, you know? So I think there's all these different levels of what it means to be toxic.
Right. And yeah, just to wrap that up, it's interesting because you got two different groups that are both advocating eating clean. Yeah. But then it ends up creating a toxic environment between the two of them. I just thought that was,
and it's so interesting because it's just what people are going after. Like, for veganism, for example, there are some people who are vegans because it is a way, like, it's a lifestyle, and they're trying to truly eat healthy, and so they focus on plants and vegetables and other types of food like that.
Right.
Then there are the vegans who just don't want to eat meat. but they can still eat Oreos and whatever
Right,
else.
right.
I mean, so it's not really necessarily a health practice.
Yeah, you're right. Oreos are vegan technically.
And I could actually be wrong on this. I think Cheez-Its are too, which is kind of ironic.
That is ironic.
I would have to actually double check that one.
Yeah, Cheez-Its.
Yeah. But there are a lot of those type of foods that are considered vegan.
Which makes you wonder, like, is it even, like, can they even call it a Cheez-It if it's not even made from a dairy product?
Yeah.
And, like, cheese is dairy, you know?
Well, and I see it a lot, too. I'm in a dye-free community of people trying to eliminate dyes from their, specifically kids' food. That's kind of what the group focuses on. And there are the people who are doing it, I mean, they're all doing it to be healthy to an extent. But there are the people who truly are like, hey, I'm going to be dye-free, which means if I stop eating processed food, you're getting rid of dyes, right? Like, there are no dyes in a potato.
Right,
you know
right,
what I mean?
right.
Like,
Yeah.
or if I'm eating carrots.
Well, even meat, like, to a degree, they man, what is it called? Phosphates?
They can put things in meat to look a certain way.
To make it look red.
Yeah. However, then there are the people who will say, well, Oreos are dye-free. So I'm just instead of having my kids eat Skittles, they're eating Oreos. And now, I mean, I'm not blaming them because you are still getting rid of the dyes. And if that is your one goal, that's still good. Like, you are still having a goal and you're achieving it, and it is eliminating something bad from your kid's diet.
Right.
But there are plenty of them that just simply swap out arguably bad food for bad food.
Right.
And so it's just kind of interesting, like, all the different levels of things. It's
That
not
is
necessarily switching something bad for something good and nutritious. It's almost like something bad for something less bad.
Right. Yeah, it's just a scale of bad.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the last section here, this is the part where I'm saying clean versus unclean. So, I do think that with toxicity, there is an element of it that, like, okay, let's say I'm going to a hazmat call, right? And it's a tanker is flipped over and it's spilling milk. Like, it's just milk. That's not toxic. That's not bad, right? It could be. I don't know. It's like the milk in your jug, right? 1 gallon of milk is different than 1,000 gallons of milk, right? Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent, but
okay, wasn't
you gotta be
quite
careful.
following that.
So you got to be careful. Necessarily, it's clean versus unclean.
Is it like Schrodinger's milk?
Well, I'm just saying it's still.
You just don't know if it's in the tanker.
It's still.
You don't know if it's
I'm
clean
saying
or
it's
unclean.
still a substance, right? It's still like you have the tendency to like roll up on that and say, okay, well that's not toxic, but it's like, well, it's not toxic in my glass at home in a little increment, but if it's in 1,000 gallons, it might take on some sort of different. Like for instance, if I washed it out into a field, right? And then that large amount of milk curdles or spoils, right? It could be toxic then.
Maybe. I mean, is that a thing?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Okay, I don't actually know. So that's what I'm trying to see.
I kind of think so. I'll have to research that after this.
Okay.
But
and you could, I could maybe believe that, like, hey, if you said I'm going to take 1,000 pounds of milk and put it in my garden, it's going to kill the plants.
Well, like for instance.
But I'm also curious if that is true.
For instance, there was this guy that they responded to this large, I believe it was a tire fire, in Texas actually. And they just started putting copious amounts of water on it, trying to put this thing out. And they couldn't put it out. So it's like more water. And they're just pouring water on this fire for days. Well, all of the runoff from that tire fire went into a stream. And then that stream went down and got into drinking water, right? And so people got cancer from this act, right?
Yes.
When you think, no, we got to put the fire out. But it's like, maybe you got to get bulldozers in there and bury it instead of
you got to think about the consequences of those
things. of your interaction with it. Anyway, so clean versus unclean. One of the drivers of ideologies and cultures throughout the ages, I believe. So the term clean versus unclean is almost straight lifted out of Jewish culture. And, the old law, they had very distinct clean and unclean rules. Like they had everything defined. They had books written about what is clean, when it was unclean, when you could eat it, when you couldn't eat it, how you had to prepare it, all these different things. And you could see how an aspect of that is just sheer honoring the God, that they all worship. You could also easily see, dude, these are people living, in what we would define as third world. And if you eat something bad, it could kill you, right? If you got food poisoning in, 2000 or 0 AD, it could probably kill you. You had to be very careful with what you ate. So it makes sense that they had pretty strict rules. I think of like Bushido, Japanese culture, where you wear those little block shoes and then you kick them off at the door. And so you're only walking inside. Yeah. And now if you think about it, animals, you're living on a farm, you're walking through possibly dirt roads and everything. You might want to be very careful about what's on your feet and what you're tracking through your house,
It's also, I feel like, not that you're not saying this, I just feel like it's a respect thing as well, that Eastern cultures do really well of respecting what they have, which I think can still be related to toxicity in a way.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of times in American culture, we don't respect things. So who cares if it's dirty or who cares what happens?
We'll just throw it out and get a new one.
Yeah. Whereas it's like, well, but if I truly take care of this, it can last me for years and years.
Right. It's like how you look at contamination.
Yeah.
And how you define clean and unclean. And so I thought a portion of it was probably identifying danger, and how do we define clean? So this is kind of to wrap it off, because I've grown up in fire stations. I've been in fire stations for like 15 years. And one of the things that's always bothered me is, well, I say always, it didn't really bother me until you like made me aware of it. But, at the end of every meal, you take time and you clean the kitchen to make sure, one, it's clean and reset. And that way, if anybody comes in there and they make a mess, they're responsible to clean that mess. But we're going to clean our collective lunch's mess, right? Well, at some point in every cleanup session, somebody reaches underneath the counter, grabs whatever cleaning solution is in whatever bottle, and starts to spray it all over the kitchen, right? And I was, I would say, guilty of this for a lot of years.
Yeah.
Where I would have the 409.
Yes.
And I would
I walk in the kitchen and it was like, the smell just hits you.
Yeah, I would spray everything, scrub everything down, and I would clean with 409, because that's what you did. You cleaned with 409. And then you get to thinking about it, and it's like, hey, some guy walks in there and he just wants a peanut butter and honey sandwich. Probably me, because I eat a lot of peanut butter and honey sandwiches. He walks in there and he throws...
You also don't grab a plate.
I do, typically now.
Sometimes.
But anyway, you grab your bread, you toss it out on the counter. It's a clean counter, right? We just cleaned it. You toss your bread out on the counter. You go grab your peanut butter. You grab your honey and everything. You make your peanut butter and honey sandwich. You have your bread open on the counter. You get it, everything. You flip it up, and then you just eat it. Man, everything's clean. We're sanitized. But now I just ingested 409 into my body.
Which is not meant to be ingested.
Yeah, because I just exposed my food to, or let's say I'm leaning on the countertop with my hands. And I'm switching my hands, and I'm leaning on the countertop, and then I take my hands. What do I have on my hands? How do you define clean and how do you define unclean? And then where am I putting it? I'm putting it all over the place. And so, like, you showed me that just wipe it down with soap and water, and we're good to go. And that's mostly water,
Well, and you can use vinegar.
You can use
mix lemons with, there's so many other natural ways, especially for the kitchen.
Right.
There's certain, the toilet, I'm going to use a cleaner because I want that to be clean, disinfected as much as possible.
The poop off.
Yes. But then, the kitchen, it's like, well, if this is the countertop that I am putting food on, or, especially our island is a butcher
chopping
block.
Yeah.
So, food actually does go on it many times. Or kids will just, they'll go put a thing of pretzels out on it or whatever.
Right.
And it's like, well, okay, what are we putting on this?
So, that's what wiping down countertops with like a toxin, which is what we do. We do that. Like, and if anybody that's listening doesn't agree with that, just go get a cup and go underneath your counter, and whatever cleaner that you typically use, just do like one spray in there, fill it up with water and drink it.
Well, I mean, the bottles say not to do that.
Yeah,
right?
no one's going to do that. No one's going to do that because like I don't want anything close to right? That stuff is nasty. I wouldn't ever drink it. But we're putting it onto a surface that we then consume things off of. So it's getting into your body, you are ingesting it into a certain degree. And so one of the other things that I thought was interesting about toxicity was like, at Bell Helicopter, whenever I was getting my airplane rescue and firefighting certification, we toured Bell Helicopter. And one of the things you notice at Bell Helicopter super quick is it doesn't look like a ragtag factory with just workers going at it, right? It is like lines on the ground. Everything is squeaky clean. Everything is mopped and swept. And every tool has an outline of where that tool is supposed to be on the wall. And I think even in a lot of places, you have to tag tools out. So if I want a tool, I have to walk to a counter, say, can I have this tool? They give me a tag. I take the tool. I use the tool. I bring it back. I get, like they keep a count of because it's called FOD. I actually had to text your dad and ask him because it didn't seem right to me. That didn't sound, that was what was popping in my head. But it's foreign object debris. And so everybody's on the lookout. If I dropped a pin on the ground, that's FOD. Where did that pin come from? How long has it been there? Did one drop into a motor or into an engine?
You have to be incredibly careful about what's going on. Like, they have to be.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, and all of their rules are because something happened.
It's because of safety. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because something failed or some cog in the, in the process was like screwed up. And so I thought it was kind of interesting that because there, you're in a machine shop, tools in a consideration are toxic, right? Because they can be out of place and literally kill people.
Yes.
You don't like that one?
I don't dislike it because I get what you're saying, so it obviously works.
It's metaphorical.
You're communicating the right idea. I'm just still curious, and this is something I'd actually have to go look up. Is there another word for it? Right? Or is that truly the word that we should be using? Is that everything out of place is just toxic?
No.
I'm not saying that's what you're saying.
Yeah, okay.
But a tool misplaced in a manufacturing factory, for example, can be harmful.
Right.
Does that mean it's toxic?
Mm.
Or is there a difference between this misplaced object is harmful or could be has the potential to be harmful versus this is toxic?
No, I can vibe with that.
And I don't know. I'm just questioning it.
I'm trying to think now that you say that, I feel like I should have that word. I should be.
And
able
I
to
understand it as metaphor, but I'm wondering for an actual use, is it true to say that just because something is in the wrong spot, it is actually toxic?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Or I guess I'm also wondering if just because something has the potential to be toxic, do we still call it toxic?
Well, it's not toxic until, right? Like water is not toxic until you drink too much or you drown, right? So it's not like a toxin.
Well, and then maybe I am overthinking the metaphor, but I'm just questioning the limits of the word.
Okay.
Is there a difference then to say this misplaced wrench is now a hazard or is now dangerous versus toxic?
Mm.
Or do you see dangerous and toxic as mutually?
So I would actually go back to at the beginning whenever I was defining it. You have a hot zone, a warm zone, and a cold zone. To me, that's what makes something toxic, right? If everything's in the right zone, it's not necessarily considered toxic. Maybe.
I don't know. Maybe I think you could argue that, like, let's say you went into a factory, for example, and everything was misplaced, no one knew where things were.
That's a toxic environment.
That is a toxic environment. But are those objects then considered toxic?
Toxins?
I feel like that's pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, that is. I mean, we're taking it to the limit.
Well, and that's, I think it is important to question it because we do use it so freely nowadays. This is toxic. This lighting is toxic. This relationship is toxic.
Right.
My mom is toxic. And it's just like everything is toxic, that I am curious if sometimes we use it in place of other things and we're not being very specific.
Well, I mean, I do feel like we're probably on the edge of ambiguity at every turn.
Well,
now.
And it's something I think I'm more aware of now because of the freshmen I work with. One thing I really try to teach them is to be specific. We say a lot of words without meaning anything many times.
Right.
And I'm not saying like you specific. I'm just saying like what I see in cultures that we take a word and then we just apply it to whatever situation and then it loses its specificity. And so I do see people nowadays where it's like, well, this is toxic, this is toxic, this is toxic. And I almost wonder if they say that because they don't have another way to actually define it.
Well, and we didn't even talk, we haven't even talked necessarily about one of the most prominent uses. I think we'll probably wrap it up on this one. We'll just end on this discussion. But one of the terms that popped into my head pretty quickly was toxic masculinity, right?
Well, yes.
And especially with our like Barbie episode having come out like, not too long ago. I do feel like toxic masculinity specifically is something that pops up a lot. And, I go back and forth. One of the things I was wanting to look up, I just remembered now, was I was wanting to look up James Cameron, the
Oh, yes.
Look that up real quick to see what his term is that he uses on it. But it's interesting because there is an aspect of, so if you say toxic masculinity, to me, one of the things that's interesting would be to define the thresholds, right? Let's define the zones. So there is the hot zone, right, of toxic masculinity, where you have like a guy beating a woman, right? Full aggro, physically assaulting somebody, right? Like there are times when going full aggro is a good thing, but then there's other situations where that is a toxic thing. So that's why, like, for instance, guys in a jiu-jitsu class or girls in a jiu-jitsu class for that matter, right? Going, getting serious about it and really trying hard. In the right environment, that's not a bad thing. But in the wrong environment, you got something?
No, not
yet. In the wrong environment, that can be a bad thing, right? You can then have like a toxic environment. And so I think it's funny because within the concept, the thing that always gets lost is just masculinity, right? Is there, like, masculinity can exist and does exist in a degree that is not toxic.
It can exist and not be toxic, and it can also exist and be toxic. I think it's, again, one of those things that's a level.
Well, see, and so, did you find that on James Cameron?
No, the only thing that pulled up was, I guess, James Cameron made a comment about testosterone being a toxin.
Oh, okay. And so what's interesting about that, one of the things I wanted to
I didn't want to dive into the whole article, so
one of the things I wanted to just mention about that is, like, James Cameron has cojones the size of beach balls, probably, right? We watched one of his documentaries where he literally got into this, like, 3-foot ball of glass and lowered himself to the bottom of the Mariana Trench.
It wasn't glass, was it?
Well, I mean, a plexiglass, some sort of a polymer probably, but, I mean, it's just a little ball.
It is tiny, and he went down to the
bottom of the ocean.
He's one of 3 people who has ever done that.
I'm trying to remember, like, the descent took like 8 hours.
I don't remember. It was hours. I don't remember exactly how long.
It was a long time. Like, it took hours to get down there. He spent like an hour kind of scooting around the bottom, and then it took him hours to get back to the surface. And in that time period, he's in this little ball. and there's this part in it where he has to flip the switch and it drops the weights. And that's how he basically it creates a buoyancy and he floats up to the surface. Well, if he flips that switch and those weights don't drop, he's dead. There's no way for him to get up.
And they cannot save him.
And so I thought it was interesting because he's like in a lot of ways, especially the old school definition. Like I think if you went to like the boomers and said, hey, how do you define, masculinity? They'd say like Neil Armstrong landing on the moon, or maybe go back to the trenches of World War I, going over the top, right? These really bold, but you look at, if you went to like Neil Armstrong, I think the same thing as if you went with James Cameron, you would ask him and say, hey, what's the most dangerous thing? Like what's going to get you killed? And it would be masculinity, like toxic masculinity. Like we're not going to pound this thing home, right? We need to be methodical.
Well, it's ego.
Ego, right. Ego.
That James Cameron, which he does talk about, which I think is what you're discussing, is when he says like there cannot be any ego in this process. Everyone has to check and double check and triple check because my life is on the line.
But
there can be no ego at the door.
But there is a certain amount, which I would define as masculine, to what he's doing, right? Exploring the depths of the ocean. There is a portion of it where it's like, I've been talking to Emmett about this. We've been trying to work this out. There are times where you have to be scared. You're gonna be scared. And you have to do that thing anyway.
Yeah.
Right? And now granted, I'm not saying that does not exist in the feminine form as well. I'm not saying that. Because I do think that there is an aspect of, I especially think of like, the mom in Grapes of Wrath, right? That woman was, she was iron fortitude, holding everything together. But I do think that there is a point like, now, maybe, I guess we can discuss it,
I just feel like this is now veering off into the topic of masculine versus feminine, and I was not prepared for that. Like, I'm not prepared.
Well, no, and I'm not meaning that. I'm just saying that there is masculine, right? Like, James Cameron has got to be masculine.
Well, it's just that masculinity is fine.
Well,
society, at least no one should be, I guess maybe some people are, but no one should be telling people not to be masculine. It's not that masculinity is the problem. I think people are trying to say toxic masculinity is the problem.
Right.
However, it's not specific enough for people to actually always understand what that is.
Well, I guess that's what I'm saying is like you have to be masculine. Like we like that in society. We like that energy, right? Of I'm going to jump my dirt bike 60 feet, or I'm going to do something that is, and I mean, you've said it, and we've now observed it with our kids. Boys are bolder and dumber than girls.
I mean, they're definitely different. There's no doubt. You can put kids in a room, and you can tell the boys and tell the girls most of the time. There are obviously outliers.
I'm just saying, like, if you turn around, like, let's say we just leave the children in a room, right? Equal number of boys, equal number of girls. When we come back, the likelihood that the girls are going to be jumping off the highest object in the room.
The boys will be hurt and everything's a weapon and they're beating each other.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But so to me,
I cannot give anything to Emmett or Callahan without it being a weapon.
Instantly. Almost instantly, right? And to me, that's like the masculine, right? And to a degree, that is fine, right? To a degree, that is fine.
Yeah.
But there is a point where it crosses over into being like a toxic thing to do, right? Now you are inflicting pain on people. You're being
you have to then teach them how to handle it.
Right.
Right. I mean, and that's something that...
Well, and I think that this is my problem. Or my proclamation, what I would propose, right? Is that our society, right? If I heard the term toxic masculinity, and I knew they weren't talking about me, right? Like you can be masculine without it being toxic masculinity, right? I think the reason that term was so blew up and had so many people in a tizzy, I think of like Ben Shapiro was probably...
Because they just hear that someone thinks masculinity is bad and they get offended without truly trying to understand what that original person is saying.
But see, that's what I'm saying. It's the word toxicity, right? That puts that toxicity, if you put that the metaphor that we set forth earlier onto it, then you shouldn't be angry with the concept of toxic masculinity, because you understand if it says toxic, that means that there is a threshold at which it is not dangerous, right? Does that make sense?
I get what you're saying. I don't think that always holds true. There are certain things that are just toxic always.
Right.
There
threshold.
are other
There's
things
a threshold, right?
that are toxic once it reaches a certain point.
Right.
Yeah.
What would your definition of something that's like always toxic?
Well, like quite literally a poison. I mean, I guess I understand what you're saying. I mean, to humans, though, there are certain things that are just always toxic.
Right.
I mean, I guess you could still argue that maybe there are still, like, you can take certain things and make medicine out of it or whatnot. Like, I do understand that.
Well, I don't know. Like, to me, one of the things that always blows my mind is, like, radiation, right? So we treat cancer with radiation. And so you do want it to be toxic.
Well, yeah,
because the whole point is it's got to kill the cancer, right?
Yeah.
So you're, like, playing with this toxicity level. And so it's not necessarily that it's just causing harm, because it might be causing good, So I think that there's an element of toxicity whenever you, like, no matter what, if you are getting radiation, it is a toxic thing.
You're only doing that because you don't have other options.
But so just because you can use it doesn't mean that it takes away the toxicity.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Anyway, it was just kind of I just wanted to break down the concept of toxicity for a little bit and just play with the idea, because really, I had in my notes, I didn't put it in these notes, but is I called it the sugar prison. And I think that that's what we were put into as children. And I think the next generation is being put into it as children, where we are like inundating our children with this highly addictive substance that is incredibly difficult to quit, And we're just saying, like, look, every holiday, eat as much candy as you want.
Well, I think that's what we could maybe do for our next episode, is go into culture's relationship with the idea of toxic. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I thought you were in.
Well, I just think there's many outlets for it, or avenues for it. But I think that's one of them, that, like, culture can look at ideology and say that is toxic. We don't, and which, I mean, I'm not disagreeing, but, like, we think extreme political views are toxic, and I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying this is something that society says a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But sugar's fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's almost like we're picking and choosing which toxins we're okay with.
And, like, that could be applied with drugs.
Well, yeah, because I think a lot of times, Reddit's kind of a funny environment, because if you go onto Reddit for any kind of advice, the first thing is always, cut out all the people in your life. Divorce your spouse. Get them out of your life. They're toxic. And it's like, okay, so I get divorced, I cut off the relationship with my parents, and I cut the kids out of my will. But, I mean, sugar's fine. And, it's like, well, It's just kind of interesting what we want to allow in our culture and what we don't want to allow.
Or what we make excuses for.
Yeah.
There's a lot of times, that's one of the biggest hampers, I think, to, like, individuals growing in our society, is that there is such this, but it's good for you.
Well,
like, treat yourself kind of, like, idea,
And that's something else that, again, I don't know if we've got time to explore right now, but maybe for a future episode. I don't know if the goal is to actually get rid of everything that's toxic. There are certain toxins that are, again, truly killing us and are bad. There are others that I wonder if there's just always a level of toxins in our culture, and we just need to learn how to navigate it.
We didn't even talk about, like, bugs.
Yeah?
Like, there are bugs that'll bite you, and you have a toxic interaction with them,
Yeah. Because I just think...
Or no, I guess toxic would be if you ate it. Poisonous?
It's poisonous if you eat it. It is venomous if it bites you. But yeah, there's just, let's see, where was I going with it? Oh yeah, it's just like I can look at how society applies the word toxic now, But then I also feel like, well, if you retroactively applied the word toxic to things throughout history, everything has always been toxic. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, war is toxic. And yeah, it is, obviously. Or like you could look at relationships. Like, well, parents were toxic to their children. Well, teachers were toxic to their students.
Until you get back to hunter-gatherer tribes.
And I haven't studied it enough. But you can even look at food where it's like, yes, a good healthy diet is what we all should strive for. But then you also look at people throughout history. There are many people who couldn't afford still the good food and just ate bread for every meal. Do you know what I mean? Because it was cheap to make.
Right.
And it's like, well, okay, well, sometimes I wonder if our striving for a completely toxic-free environment is pointless. Or not pointless, but
well, I think
fruitless.
To me, existing in the warm zone, you can exist in the warm and the cold zone without ever going into the hot zone. The hot zone is where you're gonna die.
Yeah, because there are truly things that, hey, like for example, if someone is beating you, that is a toxic relationship. Get out of it. Right. That is bad. I would never ever stand for that. If there's someone who's just not nice to you and you don't love being around them, should you banish them from your life completely? I don't know. I mean, some people you do just have to learn how to deal with. Does that mean you need to go quit your job immediately? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, some of those are for personal decisions.
Right.
But sometimes I think we're very quick to say, well, something's toxic, cut it out.
Right.
And we all have to learn how to live with some level of
some
toxicity.
degree of toxicity
in our life. Because you just can't cut it all out. I can't quit my job, get divorced, banish my kids.
This doesn't fit. This doesn't fit. This is more of like a tolerance. But, I think back on like when we used to rock climb, and, you could tell the people that came in and weren't acclimated to it because their skin would hurt really quickly. So like they might have muscles to keep going, but it's just like, man, my skin hurts. Like I can't climb anymore because my finger, the skin. And then you end up building up a callus. So through exposure over time, you build up a resistance to it.
Yeah.
And then you can endure more, And so I kind of wonder if that, hits, to a degree, part of getting older and growing up and maturing is that you realize that every little thing doesn't affect you and most stuff doesn't have anything to do with you. So if somebody hurts your feelings or if somebody is rude to you or somebody is demeaning to you, like now, especially if I'm at, work or something like that and somebody's like yelling at me, it's like, doesn't even affect me, because I can separate. It's like whenever I'm at work, I might get yelled at. And if they're yelling at me, typically they're not yelling at me. They're kind of yelling at the institution of it, or they're mad at the institution of it or whatever. Let's see, where was I going with that?
I'll carry on for you.
Okay.
Just because I do feel like often we are seeking a happy lifestyle, which is good. I'm not opposed to that by any means. But sometimes I feel like we expect happiness all of the time. Or we expect happiness to be the absence of anything bothering you. And so anything that is encroaching on your happiness is toxic. And that's where I feel like it can get... the idea of toxic whatever can be toxic. Because... we're humans, right? Like, so any relationship, I think, at some point will be tested or people will be toxic because that's being human.
Right.
Work is always going to be work. So there are always going to be, you have to show up to get paid to eat. There's always going to be a level of toxicity there.
Right.
You could name it with anything, that there is always going to be some aspect of it that's not great. Because that's just life. And that doesn't mean that that's bad or that makes you unhappy. You just, again, have to learn how to tolerate some of this stuff. So I just wonder if our labeling of everything being toxic is in itself toxic.
Well, and I think through the understanding of the word toxic, that's what I was bringing up with toxic masculinity. You've got to understand that it's a proximity. Yeah. It's a concentration issue.
Well, and
right?
everybody's going to have different levels, different thresholds for different things.
And so just because, like, for instance, you're saying a relationship with your parent, just because it's toxic doesn't mean that you can't have the right distance to them.
Yeah, maybe you don't need to see them every day.
Right.
But
maybe
you don't have to cut them out completely.
Right. Maybe you don't talk to them every day. Maybe you don't see them every week. But hey, maybe once a month.
Yeah, you got to find what works for you.
And maybe it's that you don't go over to their house. Maybe y'all meet out for lunch, right? So that you can like limit your time with them or something.
Yeah.
And so it's understanding that the only defense against toxicity is insulation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I started off the episode with.
I know. I see what you did there.
Yeah, thanks. But anyway, so that's kind of the concept, is that, identify, I guess the key takeaway would be identify the things that in your life are currently at a toxic level, and maybe experiment with a little bit of insulation in between them. That doesn't necessarily mean complete cutting it out of your life, but maybe you just change your relationship with it, change your distance to it, and then see if then that there's a way of changing the concentration of it, or changing, that's one of the things with hazmat is there was this one guy was talking. So there was flame. Let's say that there's flames impinging on this container, right? And it's venting off, and you have that option of going over and closing that vent, right? That could be the exact wrong thing to do, because it's venting for a reason, right? If you close it off, now it's going to explode. So you've got it. Sometimes it looks bad, but it's not that bad. Anyway, thank y'all for watching. Hopefully y'all enjoyed this episode, and until next time, peace.
Goodbye.